To get your copy of Matrix Madness, you'll need to copy and paste or click the link that's below this video in the video description. Once you do that, a screen like this will pop up and you'll simply need to click the blue Make a Copy button. One of my favorite things about using matrices in class is that it really puts the onus on the students to make connections or find disparities or contrasts in whatever you want them to do. And this is likely, depending on the words or the characters or the terms that you choose, not something that's going to easily be found online. This copy here is something that you can easily print out after you edit it. The first slide is student instructions, and I've included all the instructions here for you. The only things that you will need to change on this slide are things in the brackets, and you can delete the brackets. And once you've decided whether you're going to use characters or terms or vocabulary words or equations, you can replace those brackets with whatever word or term you're going to have students make comparisons or contrasts between. So we'll just use vocabulary words here. And if you decide to use vocabulary words, we'll just replace those brackets with the words vocabulary words in all these places. So you get the gist. So you're going to replace all of those brackets with whatever term you're going to use. This will become the student instruction sheet with an example. The example that you see below the student instructions asks students to find deep analytical connections between characters in Little Red Riding Hood. And I put 3 here. I'll show you how to edit yours on the next slide. But for student practice, or to help students understand what they're being asked to do, this is a simple example to help them. And so I've listed 3 different characters, the wolf, grandma, and Little Red Riding Hood, both in the x-axis and in the y-axis. And the job of the student then, and what this example provides, are deep analytical connections between the characters. The important part, and you'll see this in the student instructions, is that students must put in the box words that relate to or a connection that applies to both of those characters and no other character or no other vocabulary word or no other equation. And I'll show you how to alter that in yours in a second. But for the purposes here, I just use characters. And so when you see grandma show up with the wolf, in this box here, students would be asked to find a connection between grandma and the wolf that is true of just those 2 characters, but not anybody else on the chart. In this case, not true of Little Red Riding Hood. And you'll notice, for fun, the wolf and grandma show up twice. So students, in essence, have to come up with 2 deep connections between grandma and the wolf that are not true of Little Red Riding Hood. And I did provide some examples of those here in the lower right-hand corner, just so students kind of see what's expected of them. But you can go through with students and fill in these other boxes as examples so that they kind of understand what they're supposed to do with the assignment. For example, both Little Red and Grandma are naive and unsuspecting of others' evil. Obviously, that's not true of the wolf. He is evil. He understands evil. He's not naive of it. So that's a statement, a deep analytical connection that's true of Little Red and Grandma, but not the wolf. When I talk to students about deep analytical connections, I give them examples of what not to say. So they can't say that Little Red and Grandma are both females and the wolf is male, because that's a superficial connection. That's not something deep and analytical that shows me they understand how these characters interact with each other or what their motivations are in the work of literature. And then I give another example of Grandma and Little Red again, because again, that pairing shows up twice. They are characters that need rescuing from someone with more power than them, in this case, the woodcutter. The wolf doesn't need rescuing because he is powerful and he's the bad guy, so no one wants to rescue him. The other time where this activity gets really fun is when you have the same characters show up in the x-axis and the y-axis. And that's when students need to find a connection or a deep analytical idea that's true of that character or that word or that term and no other character or word or term. And this will only show up once, whereas the pairings show up twice. The individual character or word only shows up with itself one other time. The wolf is the only character that uses others' kindness for his own gain. Both Grandma and Little Red are kind, but they're not in the business of tricking people and they're not in the business of using other people. Only the wolf is using others' kindness for his own gain. This should provide students with an idea of the type of deep analytical connections that we're looking for. And again, you can fill in these blank spaces with students and go through them so that they think about it before they get to your terms or words or characters, but you don't have to. On the next slide then is where you get to change the chart into whatever you want it to be. So you can change the title of the matrix to Scientific Method Matrix Madness, and then here you'd have different steps of the scientific method. I think these are different steps of the scientific method, and then you would just repeat those across the top. And then, as with all things, you can adjust the font size so that it fits for you when you go to print it. And so you'll type all the same words in the x-axis and in the y-axis so that it goes all the way across, and then you'll just keep filling these in as you go. If you don't want all these columns and rows, you can simply click in one and then right click and say delete column or delete row. So I just clicked in the column, then I right clicked and clicked delete row. I'll delete the column again. And if there's not enough, if you want more than I have, then you just do the simple right click again and you say insert column left, and then that would give you another one. Remember, you have to have the same number of columns as you do rows because you want the exact same words in both of the columns and the rows. And then you can adjust it as needed by making it bigger or smaller to fit on the page. And when everything is the way that you want it to be, sorry, I'm totally butchering the scientific method here. Let's call it analysis. Sorry, science teachers. And once you have this all set up, then you can go File, Print, and make sure it looks the way that you want it to look. My margins are a little funky, so I'd have to change those. And then you click Print and obviously run copies for students. Alternately, you can share this with your students so that each of them gets their own individual copy. I think that's a little bit trickier. And I also like the idea of them having to use the hard copy because then they're not on the internet and they're not on their phones. Sometimes I let students use notes for this, sometimes I don't. But the best part in my mind is that it helps students or forces students to make connections that may not be found anywhere else. If we go back to the Little Red Riding Hood example, I don't know where any question is ever asking them to think about how the wolf does something or is motivated by something in a way that Grandma and Little Red are not. And the same is true of vocabulary terms as well. I mean, in terms of a hypothesis being different from everything else, what does a hypothesis have or what does a hypothesis do that these others do not do? That's something that students really have to think about. They have to think about the definition, but then they also have to think about that definition in relationship to all the other terms that you would be using. This works really well, I think, in all subject areas. In history, you can look at battles or leaders or presidents and have students compare and contrast them. In math, you can look at terms or equations or slopes and have students determine similarities or differences between the different equations or the different proofs. In science, vocab terms work really well. Maybe the different elements on the periodic table would work. In theology, maybe you're looking at different gospels, different books of the Bible, different popes, different saints. In PE, maybe you're looking at different sports or rules within those sports or different athletes or different exercises and having students compare and contrast them. The sky is really the limit, and you can do whatever you want to get students to make the connections that you want them to make. A few thoughts on how I grade this and where I use it in my class. I give students a point for each box that shows a deep analytical connection that's true of the term or true of the novel, and that also doesn't relate to any other box other than the other pairing on here. And so by this point, students know what a deep analytical connection is, and they get points for doing that. I use it in my class in a variety of ways. Sometimes students are in groups, sometimes they're individuals, sometimes they can use their notes, sometimes not. It really just depends if I want it for a formal assessment or if I try to want to figure out informally where they're at or what they understand. For characters, I like to use it at the end of a novel to see the connections that they can make as the plot develops and characters change and grow. If I were doing vocabulary terms and I had just introduced them and I wanted students to internalize them and understand them in a way more than just defining and memorizing them, I might use it right after I introduce those terms to help students get to know those terms better. It really just depends what your objective is and what you see as being the end goal, whether you're trying to introduce something or assess student understanding, or whether you want this to be a final product to see how much they can analyze based on the entire unit. If you have any more questions, feel free to email me. Happy to help in any way, shape, or form.